going to go straight on to our next speaker now. As always, massive pleasure to introduce James Davies. He's a regular speaker at our events by now. James's bio: James Davies is an associate professor of mental health and social anthropology at the University of Roehampton, is a qualified psychotherapist and the co-founder of the Council for Evidence-based Psychiatry, which is secretariat to the All Party Parliamentary Group for prescribed drug dependence. He has been an expert drug advisor for Public Health England and is the author of the best-selling book, Cracked: Why Psychiatry is Doing More Harm Than Good. So it's an absolute pleasure to have James join us, and I can wave this one to talk about this. He's recently published book Sedated: How Modern Capitalism Created Our Mental Health Crisis. I absolutely loved it. Really appreciated the bigger print. I can't articulate my thoughts about it as well as the former director of Liberty, Shami Chakrabarti, so I'm going to share her words, what she said about it. She said, "A wonderful, moving and truly life-changing book. Sedated is an urgent intervention for a post-pandemic society, written with expertise and clarity. Warning, it will cause irritation to powerful interests who fear us all becoming better informed about the root causes of so much human suffering." And that is absolutely true. So James's publisher has kindly sent over a discount code for 50% off the ebook version. So please take advantage of that if you haven't already got a copy. James, thank you for being here.
Hello, Joe. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm just trying to share my screen. Hopefully that's worked.
That's working, James. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. All right, excellent, excellent. Thanks so much for the introduction, Joe, and thanks so much for having me speak. This is the first occasion on which I've spoken about my new book. So it came out about 10 days ago. So you know, fingers crossed. Let's see how it goes. But thanks so much for inviting me. As I've got about 40 minutes or 45 minutes, I'm going to start right away. As long as everybody can see my screen, okay. A thumbs up would. Is it all good, John? Okay, excellent. Okay, well let me start, and let me start by referring to something that the psychologist Professor Richard Bentle highlighted some time ago with respect to the vast progress we've witnessed in modern medicine over the last 40 years. He said the following: if a child in the 1970s contracted leukemia, their chances of survival were around 20%. But if a child today contracts leukemia, their chances of survival are around 80%. This means that outcomes in this area of medicine have improved by a full 300% in the last 4 decades alone. And this wonderful feat is not only reserved for pediatric oncology, since impressive rates of improvement can also be found in almost every other area of medicine. I say in almost every other area, as regrettably, there is one exception: the area of psychiatry and mental health. Sadly, in this area, the area in which I work, not only have clinical outcomes broadly flatlined over the same time period, but according to some measures, they have actually got worse. For example, the effectiveness of psychiatric drugs has not increased since the 1980s, despite billions spent in research, marketing, and promotion, and despite yearly rises in prescribing. I think right now we're approaching almost a quarter of the adult population being prescribed one kind of psychiatric drug or another each year. At the same time, mental health disability rates have almost trebled in recent decades, while the prevalence of mental health problems has risen fourfold, despite levels of general well-being in the community not necessarily getting worse. Furthermore, for people diagnosed with serious mental health issues, the gap between their life expectancy and everyone else's has widened in recent decades from around 10 to 20 years. Now, these dire statistics exist despite our having invested over £250 billion in UK mental health services and research since the 1980s. And despite nearly a quarter of our adult population now receiving some kind of mental health intervention in any given year. So to understand what has gone so sorely wrong, I want to take a seemingly unconventional route. I want to take us back to August 1844, to when two young intellectuals in their mid-20s met at this cafe in Paris, a Café Regent, to discuss a terrible epidemic that was then sweeping across Europe, one rooted in the rising and rapacious industrialism of the age. For them, industrialization was making people sick as it was so exploitative. The captains of industry were paying people unlivable wages under terrible working conditions to inflate their profit margins. The two men were convinced that these exploitative arrangements had become so normalized in the population that people had lost touch with their essential human rights and needs, leaving them in a state of political apathy where they no longer believed they could fight for a better world. And in this demoralized state, all that remained for them were soothing illusions and anesthetics, sedatives to compensate for the painful oppression endured. The two men in that Parisian cafe were, of course, Frederick, Engels, and Karl Marx, and we can see them both here breaking COVID regulations, it seems, holding hands. And by the time of this, their first meeting in the Café Regent, Marx had already set about identifying what he considered to be one of the most powerful sedatives of the age, organized religion. Marx had argued that religion, by teaching people that their suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, was instructing people, and usually the most disadvantaged people, to accept and endure rather than to fight and reform the harmful social realities oppressing them. As religion sedated the distress that would otherwise galvanize people to political action, he famously referred to it as the opium of the people, an ideological sedative powerful enough to disable the human impulse for social reform. Now, while most students of sociology will be familiar with this aspect of Marx's critique, we cannot forget how radical it was at the time. In fact, what his early writings on religion helped establish was an entirely new and enduring style of analysis in the social sciences, deployed by both left and right-wing thinkers. One that focused on how the main institutions of society, whether we're looking at religion, education, law, media, these institutions always adapt to what the economic paradigm of the day demands of them, coming in effect to serve the economy's will. And this was particularly true for those institutions like religion that directly explained and managed human suffering. After all, once a sufficient number of people came to suffer under a given set of economic arrangements, those arrangements wouldn't survive for long. People would challenge them through the democratic process, through organized opposition, or when such processes failed, through civil unrest. Consequently, those social institutions responsible for managing emotional distress were critically important to the aims of any economy. They had the power to diffuse politically dangerous emotions by sedating sufferers to the real social drivers of their distress and by distracting them from what should be the true social targets of their reform. Now, the reason I've taken this detour into the salons of 18th century Paris is because I believe that the ideas hatched back then can help us go some way in explaining the failure of our mental health sector to improve its outcomes since the 1980s, during the period of what has been called late capitalism or neoliberalism. And just to define neoliberalism, neoliberalism is the word used to describe the style of capitalism that has dominated most Western societies, but in particular the US and the UK, that has dominated our societies since the 1980s, the style of capitalism introduced by Thatcher and Reagan, etc. So what I'm trying to explore today is how, since the 1980s, our mental health sector, by struggling to thrive under this new set of economic arrangements, neoliberal arrangements, has inadvertently adapted itself to serve the needs of our economy, but at the expense of generating the good clinical outcomes we all want and deserve. To understand the dynamics behind this ideological alignment between neoliberalism and our mental health sector, I want to begin by discussing by far the most dominant trend in our mental health sector since the 1980s, what has been called the over-medicalization of our emotional, behavioral, and mental lives. Since the 1980s, under the control of the psychiatric profession, the mental health sector has progressively renamed more and more of our natural and normal, albeit painful, human responses to the difficulties of living as mental disorders requiring psychiatric intervention or medical intervention. In other words, it has progressively medicalized them. It's achieved this through manuals like the DSM, the book that lists all of the psychiatric disorders believed to exist. In the case of the DSM, as many people now know, we have witnessed a rapid expansion in the number of mental disorders it contains, from around 106 in the 70s to around 365 today. In addition, these manuals have progressively lowered the bar for what constitutes having a mental disorder, making it far easier for any of us to be classed as mentally ill. By expanding the definition of mental illness to encompass ever more domains of human experience, the sector has not only reconfigured how we respond to distress in healthcare settings, but how we respond to distress in the wider social world, whether we're looking at behavioral difficulties at school, underperformance at work, grief at a significant loss, the effects of unemployment, discrimination, abuse, trauma, poverty, social exclusion, etc. These are just some of the manifold, painful human experiences now liable to psychiatric framing and psychotropic intervention. Such over-medicalization has, of course, been underwritten and promoted by the very industry set to most benefit from it, the pharmaceutical industry, which has colluded with DSM's expansion at every turn. It is now almost common knowledge that most of the psychiatrists who wrote the DSM had financial ties to the industry, including its 3 previous chairs. And I like this paper by Lisa Cosgrove, who looks at the financial conflicts of interests on members of the DSM committees. And she found that they're widespread throughout the DSM, but on the committees looking at the diagnoses for which drugs are the first line of treatment, 100% of members had these financial conflicts. So while the industry itself has promoted DSM's over-medicalization of everyday life, it's done so in clandestine ways, which I'll look at in a moment. As the most important figure in the history of DSM, Dr. Robert Spitzer acknowledged, the pharmaceuticals were delighted with the DSM, presumably because it created a vast and highly lucrative market for their products. But let me now give you a couple of examples of how pharma has surreptitiously promoted the DSM. The first example encounters something I encountered in New York City in 2014, while one evening preparing for a lecture I was set to deliver the next day at Columbia University. The lecture was on the history and the construction of DSM. I was looking for DSM sales figures when I was astonished to find that the best-selling book on Amazon.com at that time was the latest edition of the DSM 5. But more than this, DSM 5 had been the top 10 best-selling US books since its publication 6 months earlier. And to give you a sense of scale here, DSM was at number 1, while Harry Potter was at number 6, and 50 Shades of Grey was at number 9. But what bemused me even more was that DSM-5 wasn't cheap. In fact, it cost a whopping $88 per paperback copy. So who on earth was buying this vast and costly dictionary of distress? Well, a couple of days later, I put that question to a professor of psychology I was interviewing at New York University. And she told me that while undertaking research in the New York State primary care sector, she'd discovered why DSM sales were so high. That's what she said. The bottom line is that the pharmaceutical industry has been buying DSM in bulk and then distributing copies for free to clinicians up and down the country. That's why the figures are soaring. For her, it was obvious why the pharmaceutical industry would do this. As almost any kind of suffering is caught by the DSM, disseminating it is just good for business. It drives up diagnosis rates and with this, prescriptions. But let's now consider another example, this time closer to home. It concerns the depression questionnaire PHQ-9, which has been one of the most influential documents in our mental health sector, as it was used throughout primary care for over 15 years to help all GPs to assess whether or not a person is depressed, and if so, how severely. So you'd give one of these documents to a patient would fill them in, and depending on the answers given, they'd get a score for each question. The higher the score, the overall score, the more depressed they were thought to be. Now, one of the major criticisms of PHQ-9 is that it sets the bar very low for being considered to have a form of depression for which a drug should be prescribed. And yet, what the tens of millions of people who filled in this questionnaire almost certainly didn't know was that its development was funded by, its NHS distribution was paid for by, and its copyright was owned by Pfizer Pharmaceuticals, which incidentally makes 2 of the most prescribed anti-anxiety and antidepressant drugs in the UK. So here we have a company setting the bar very low for receiving a drug, while at the same time as making, selling, and profiting from that drug. The conflicts of interest are there for all to see. So the spread of medicalization has therefore opened the door to the unrestrained commodification of our distress. That is, turning our suffering into a vibrant market opportunity. And this has created, of course, a vast market for psychiatric drugs. And this market today is now worth over $25 billion each year globally. I think actually, according to other pieces of research, the figure is probably higher than 25, but anyway, that seems to be a relatively conservative estimate. But it's a large figure. Now, of course, the main benefactors of this market have been the drug companies, their shareholders, on occasion, some political allies, and those psychiatrists and organizations who've been in wide receipt of industry money in the form of consultancy fees, speakers fees, sponsorship, donations, research funding, and other contributions and honoraria, all being types of remuneration that research has demonstrated over and over to bias recipients in favor of industry products. And these kind of payments have been rife over the last few decades, less so in recent years, but certainly during the time when these drugs were really reaching cultural salience. And so while the commodification of human distress has been very profitable to sections of the psychiatric, corporate, and some areas of the political community, successfully monetizing the management of human distress, the consumers themselves, from whom all this profit is derived, may well have cause for complaint, given the poor efficacy of most psychiatric drugs when compared to placebo. And Joanna looked at some of the research in her excellent presentation I just watched. Given also the lack of declarations of conflicts of interest, which have been endemic throughout the sector, the corruption within the evidence base, which again is very well documented, largely because most of the evidence base is commissioned, funded, or conducted by the industry itself. And given the wholesale underplaying of harms and the strong association between long-term psychiatric drug use, which indeed is proliferating in society, and worsening outcomes. And in my book, Sedated, I dedicate a chapter to Robert Whittaker's excellent work, which looks at and tries to explain the correlation between rising vaulting prescriptions and vaulting mental health disability. He doesn't believe this relationship is simply a correlated relationship. There's a causal relationship going on. The drugs are generating higher disability. But of course, the widespread medicalization of distress has slotted with many other aims of late capitalism, not just the commodification of distress. For instance, in the same year that Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, with Margaret Thatcher becoming UK Prime Minister the year earlier, psychiatry for the first time began reclassifying underperformance at work, or what it called occupational dysfunction, as a key symptom of mental disorder. If you experienced fractious working relationships, if you lacked workplace motivation, or if you simply worked at a level deemed below expected, you would score high on its mental illness assessment scale, called the GAF or GAF, making you more liable for psychiatric diagnosis and treatment. Psychiatry's new project of medicalizing worker underperformance aligned perfectly, of course, with a central pillar of Reaganite and Thatcherite social policy, which was to increase what it called labor productivity. And what labor productivity is basically the output of each worker per hour of their labor. While neoliberal governments would aspire to improve or raise worker productivity with new social policies, psychiatrists and drug companies would promise to improve worker productivity by altering the very dynamics of self, tackling the low moods and poor motivation deemed to threaten the economic order. This pathologization of any economically unproductive emotional state not only chimed with the new neoliberal zeitgeist, but also saw drug companies marketing their pills as economic correctives. I'm just going to allude briefly to these reports that were funded and commissioned by Eli Lilly in the 90s that cast depression as bad for productivity and represented their pills as solutions to an economic problem. This idea that you could make use of mental health interventions to solve economic problems really begins to take root in the 1990s, and it sets in train a legacy that I argue in the book still drives our mental health policy today. The mental health interventions that get implemented by government are those that profess to solve, first and foremost, economic problems. And in the book, I write a chapter on the national therapy program, IAT, and how this was only implemented because it promised to reduce the disability and the unemployment bill, making getting people back to work a key measure of its success, which may partly explain why it has so seriously failed in terms of generating good outcomes. And there we have Matt Hancock, the notorious Matt Hancock, championing IAPT at a conference. And in a moment, I'll say a little bit more about mental health workplace consultancies that are performing a similar function. So the idea that drugs and mental health interventions can serve productivity becomes really popular from the 1980s onwards, and this begins to shape mental health policy. But another key area where medicalization chimes with economic interests is in its alignment with individualism. The idea that the individual is the sovereign architect of his or her own destiny, that the person you are has little to do with the circumstances in which you were raised, just as the good life is mostly achieved through heroic feats of individual effort rather than through collective action, togetherness, and social support. From this standpoint, success is seen as an outcome of having exceptional individual qualities rather than exceptional social privileges and advantages, and failure is seen as rooted in personal deficits rather than in lack of opportunity, equality, and social support. This pivot in the 1980s towards locating failure in self rather than in system not only helped justify cutting many welfare, labor, and social protections, but also nurtured deep political quietism in the populace when it came to how we understand and manage failure and emotional distress. Not only was mental suffering no longer seen as the organism's legitimate protest against difficult social conditions that held us back, conditions that needed to be rectified. And by the way, this was an idea that was more popular in the more socially democratic style of capitalism of the 60s and 70s. But instead, suffering was now seen from the 80s onwards as an index of internal dysfunction that needed treatment. This shift towards favoring self-reform through drug interventions over social reform through social policy interventions was symbolized when the US Congress in the 1980s slashed funding for social, community, mental health services and benefits, while at the same time as it doubled the research funding for biological psychiatric treatments. We also witnessed a similar move in the UK, where the new project of caring for people in the community became tantamount to managing patients' medication in the community. Now, all of these changes dovetailed with another core function of the mental health sector that has come to serve neoliberalism well, which is its capacity to frame suffering in ways that protect the current economic order from criticism, downplaying the social and political causes of distress, a process known as depoliticization. So to give you a couple of examples of how depoliticization operates in the mental health sector, I'd like to introduce you to someone called Dr. China Mills, who is an associate professor of global mental health at the University of London, and someone I interviewed for my book back in 2019. And she gave me a very potent example of how depoliticization works, one she encountered during her fieldwork in central India. And this example concerns the terrible epidemic of farmer suicides that blighted central India between 2000 and 2010. An epidemic that was largely, it turns out, caused by bad social policy. At this time, to give you some background, multinational agricultural companies were trying to create new markets in India for their products. And they were doing so by replacing the traditional crops that farmers had always used with genetically modified plants that didn't produce any seeds. Now, what this meant is that local farmers could no longer continue to save their seeds for next year's crop as they'd always done. Rather, now the farmers had to buy expensive new plants each year from the multinationals, which put many of them into crushing debt and poverty. And as a result, and as the research indicates, hundreds of thousands of farmers were killing themselves under the resulting stress, mostly by drinking toxic pesticide. But in the face of these terrible suicides, rather than challenge the multinationals, the Indian state set about sending in teams of psychiatrists and psychologists to tackle what was now being framed as a mental illness epidemic. It also launched a campaign with the World Health Organization to make antidepressants more freely available to the farmers, a campaign that was also partly funded, it turns out, by these very agricultural companies. It was as if the primary solution to the suicide epidemic was psychiatric rather than political. Nowhere was suicide seen as a desperate response to a situation made unbearable by the multinationals. Now, this misuse of the mental illness narrative, I think, illustrates the essence of how depoliticization works. It effectively turns socially caused problems into internal dysfunctions, making the self the site of reform and thereby exonerating harmful social, corporate, and political arrangements, and so by implication, helping nullify in people the forces that push for social change. But depoliticization is clearly not just a problem in India. It, of course, operates here too. And to illustrate this, I now want to turn to my second example, which considers the growing problem of work dissatisfaction in the UK, a problem that is now also, I argue, being depoliticized. So to introduce you to this problem, I'd like you to consider an event that occurred back in 2015, where many commuters on the London Underground encountered these curious statements above their seats on train after train. And there were lots of these posters dotted all over the place with different statements, and here are three of those statements. It's as if someone were out there making up pointless jobs for the sake of keeping us all working. Huge swathes of people spend their days performing tasks they secretly believe do not really need to be performed. How can one even begin to speak of dignity in work when one secretly feels one's job should not exist? While you'd expect most people to smile wryly at yet another oddity on the tube, that's not quite how things played out. These posters rather set off a social media storm with tens of thousands of people posting and discussing them online. Around the same time that these posters appeared, I was involved in a research initiative at the University of Exeter, and we were exploring the relationship between poor mental health and work-life balance. And as part of my contribution, I was reviewing the research literature on worker dissatisfaction, and I was encountering some pretty worrying stats. For instance, I found that we were basically doing a big literature review, and we found that around 2/3 of UK employees identify as being dissatisfied with or emotionally disengaged from the work they do. And what does emotionally disengaged mean? It means they've got no emotional relationship to their work. It leaves them emotionally cold. Also, around 40% of people feel that their jobs make no meaningful contribution to society at all. And in fact, during the pandemic, I know we've all heard a lot about how it's adversely affected our mental health. And of course, some people's mental health, it has adversely affected, and that's the narrative we've heard. What we've heard far less about is the positive effects that, in particular, the first lockdown had for many people. For instance, a study in the Lancet, a recent study, showed that around a third of the population actually experienced a boost in well-being and a sense of relief after the first lockdown. And a big YouGov survey found that only 9% of people reported wanting life to return to normal after the pandemic was over. And one of the main reasons people stated again and again as to why they didn't want life to go back to business as usual was because of work, and being away from jobs that they disliked and found disengaging and dissatisfying was really quite liberating for a lot of people. So worker dissatisfaction is endemic in contemporary society. But in addition to that, levels of worker dissatisfaction have gone up since the 1980s, a steady trend upwards, for a whole host of different reasons, and I'll look at a couple of those in a moment. And of course, this is now being estimated in economic terms. So what is the cost of such dissatisfaction at work? Well, depending on the study you consult, it's between 30 billion and 50 billion pounds a year is being lost to poor worker productivity. And so as a result, employers are beginning to act, and they are largely doing so by turning to organizations like these, the mental health consultancies. And there is an ever rich and diverse array of these consultancies growing up. There's around 80 at the moment, and together these consultancies are permeating pretty much most workplaces in the UK today. And what these mental health consultancies do is they market themselves very successfully as the solution to lost worker productivity caused by poor mental health. And what these consultancies do effectively is they train middle managers in the company or in selected employees to be the kind of go-to people in the office if somebody is struggling with their emotional health. And so they train these go-to people to identify other people in the office who may be suffering in silence. And the aim of these go-to people, these first aiders, they're called mental health first aiders, is to identify these people and then advise these people to go and seek out help for their problems. And the argument is this is good for the individual, and of course it's good for the corporation because you safeguard the corporation for having to pick up the costs of a particular member of staff going on sick leave or etc. and so forth. Now, as part of the research for my book, I actually underwent one of these trainings myself, and I became one of these go-to people in the office. So I went through the training. Let me just tell you a little bit about the training. The training lasts for about 2 days. So it's very short. That's about the standard length. And in those 2 days, they really pack it in. You get given a whole host of information. I was finally taught, I mean, I've been waiting to find out about this for years, but I was finally taught what mental illness is. I was taught how to spot the signs of mental illness in my co-employees, which was a key part of it. And they give you various devices by which you can identify such illness. And one of the things they do is give you a list of what mental illness looks like. And I just want to provide you with a list that is offered by one of the main consultancies, ACAS. And this is what it describes as the common symptoms of mental ill health. And this is what they might include. So we have things like increase in unexplained absences or sick leave, poor performance or timekeeping, poor decision making, lack of energy, uncommunicative or moody behavior. Now, ACAS, and by the way, this is representative of the kind of thing you hear in these consultancy trainings. Now, ACAS provides no rationale for why these experiences should be read as symptoms of illness. This is all the more surprising since none of these experiences actually map onto any official diagnostic criteria for depression or anxiety, as problematic as these criteria obviously are. But what is even more surprising is that all of these experiences could be better interpreted in non-medical ways as classic signs of worker dissatisfaction and disengagement. In other words, this isn't mental illness. This is what people experience when they don't like their jobs. So what we have here is a reframing of worker dissatisfaction, this endemic social problem, as mental health problems for which the individual is largely responsible. But what is even more concerning is about this sort of crude medicalization of worker distress, is that when Public Health England was commissioned to do the first major review of these consultancies, they could find no evidence whatsoever that they directly improved worker productivity, raised staff well-being, or saved employers a single penny. And yet, despite there being no evidence for their efficacy, so to speak, the popularity of these consultancies with employers continues to grow and grow. And this became a question of my why. Why are they popular when it's clear they're not effective? Well, the conclusion I come to is that these consultancies are so popular, not because they do what they say they do on the tin. They're so popular because they do something else that's very valuable to employers. They carefully control the narrative about the causes of workplace distress and dissatisfaction. They locate workplace distress within the individual ailments rather than in institutional processes, thereby acquitting the workplace itself from causal responsibility. Well, at the same time, they provide employers with moral cover, as they can now claim in good faith they are taking steps to tackle poor mental health at work. But of course, these consultancies also receive good backing and funding from the UK government, despite their having no efficacy. And why is that? Well, I believe the reason for this is because they sell the idea that our suffering at work is more to do with a growing epidemic of mental illness than with any wider structural problems in our economy, such as, for example, flatlining wages, rising wage inequality, increased shortism in the employment market, the erosion of unionized working protections, longer working hours, growing pressure for dual working households, lower job security, higher job precarity, and the rapid expansion of the service sector, to name a few. But such depoliticization of distress to protect economic conditions of modern working life does not only permeate our workplaces, it colours every social institution where mental health tropes are now embedded. Just consider, for example, how rising diagnoses of mental illness in our school children is significantly fueled, I argue in the book, by the terrible pressures modern schools are under. While on the one hand, school resources are ever more depleted due to years of austerity, on the other hand, schools are under ever greater pressure to deliver on a whole host of government-set outcome measures imposed via Ofsted. Being forced to succeed under growing financial distress or duress, schools have been trying to find a way out, and many have done so by leveraging mental illness labels or special needs designations, as these win additional funding for classrooms and give special allowances in Ofsted league tables. I recognise this is a controversial argument, but I do set out the reasons for why I believe it to be legitimate in my book. Of course, or just consider how the mental illness narrative is being used to distract from the real reasons for growing despondency and depression in our undergraduate population, which is far higher than it was 15 to 20 years ago, according to a whole host of different measures. This is just one of them. This is self-reported distress. And this distress is rising largely because present-day undergraduates seem to sense they are entering a far less benevolent world. where there are now large student debts to repay, decreased prospects of owning a home, where the job market is more competitive, where wages are flatlining, where careers for life are disappearing, and where levels of worker dissatisfaction, as we've seen, are escalating. Despite the obvious economic reasons for higher despondency in present-day undergraduates, the narrative around worsening student mental health is still mostly depoliticized. The cry is for more mental health services, more mental health consultancies, not for serious reflection and reform on the harmful social policies that dampen young people's hopes and dreams. In this latter domain, it feels too big, too immovable. So instead we focus on mental health away days, relaxation hours, and better access to GPs. So in short, what should have been a national conversation about where neoliberal policy has corrosive emotional effects in our public sector, in our schools, in our workplaces, in our universities, in our wider economy, instead becomes a conversation about the growing epidemic of mental illness in all these domains of modern life. A conversation often draped in sanctimonious and conspicuously pious calls for more mental health provision, less mental health stigma, more mental health conversations, that is, in ever louder calls for more of the failing same. Of course, I could pile up many more examples of how mental health tropes regularly hijack attention away from bad social policy, silencing inconvenient political and public discussion, turning social problems into mental health problems to be managed by clinicians, not politicians. Of course, I could do that. But rather than that, I want to highlight one final feature of depoliticization that does not get the attention it deserves: decollectivization. By sweeping the social causes of distress into the private corners of self, our mental health sector is helping stifle community and collective action, treating people in isolation from their community and alienating them from the social drivers of their distress, neuters the impulse for social reform. After all, it's only when groups come together to recognize where their experiences of distress are shared that political action becomes possible. Shared distress, or social suffering, as the anthropologists have called it, is what motivated the civil rights movement of the 60s, the women's liberation movement of the 90s, the Black Lives Movement today. In these and countless other cases, recognizing the often communal roots of pain was the first step in organizing towards social change. But by dispersing our distress into different self-residing dysfunctions, our current mental health sector simply scatters and diminishes collective experience. Now, diagnostic tribes replace political tribes as we identify with a given mentally ill patient collective rather than with a particular social cause, or securing the rights of our particular mentally ill collective become the only one social cause. So to bring my conclusion, my paper to an end, and to reach my conclusion, I just want to say that the final parting words. The alignment of our mental health sector with new capitalism or neoliberalism, I believe, was never purposefully plotted behind the scenes. The actual truth, I think, is far less enticing. Our mental health system has, like most other major social institutions, simply come to embrace those ideas and practices that have best secured its own perpetuation. It has become what it is and has continued to thrive and expand despite its poor outcomes by following the path of least resistance, by moving with rather than defying the dominant neoliberal tide. As Michel Foucault once put it, political power embraces the ideas and practices that best serve its own aims and interests. ideas and practices that come to shape reality on the ground. So the interventions and ideas that get funded and implemented are the ones that ignite the ideological passions of those with the power to make the call. The great fault in our services then lies just as much with those who have funded bad ideas as with those who initially contrived them and then marketed them in politically enticing ways. Unfortunately, the outcome of this mutually beneficial alliance has been ongoing poor outcomes, growing harms and public disillusionment, as well as the almost endless string of costly systemic service failures we witnessed everywhere today. So just as religion served industrial capitalism of the mid-1800s, our mental health sector today now performs a similar function. The mental health interventions we have preferred since the 80s are ones that have medicalized, pathologized, depoliticized, commodified, and individualized our emotional distress, robbing our suffering of its capacity to illuminate social ills, galvanize social action, and facilitate lasting and meaningful personal and social change. From this standpoint, I believe it is now correct to view our mental health sector as the new opium of the people, a sector that sedates us both literally and ideologically, a sector whose structural roots need to be more fully apprehended if we are ever to give meaningful reform a meaningful chance. Thanks. I'll leave my presentation there.